Hi, everybody. It's a fine, fine day. Appreciate you sticking with it. We're getting late in the course now. Let's get the war, see if we can finally get the war ended. It's a very, very fine thing to do and give peace a chance. This is Dr. Winkler. This is the World War I class. And this is lecture 27. Let's see where we're at as far as the war is concerned. How everything's going here. Let's look at what's happening with Germany. If we look at the scope of World War I, we're going to see that even though the Germans don't have as much success as they would like to have, particularly on the Western Front, overall they've done quite well. Can we say in virtually every year of the war, they've knocked out one of their less important enemies. In 1914, they knock out Belgium. In 1915, they knock out Serbia. In 1916, I didn't make a big deal over this, but it's worth mentioning. Romania. They knock out Romania in 1916. Let me tell you what happened. Romania has looked at the ebb and flow of the war and wondered which side they should come in on. Because if you come in, you have a better chance of getting some land. One of the reasons why they decide to come in on the side of the Allies is what Romania wants, is a big hunk of Austria. Now, it doesn't matter that a lot of Germans live in this area. It doesn't matter that a lot of Magyars, Hungarians live in this area, and other minorities. The area is still predominantly Romanian, and they want that in the Romanian state. If they're going to get a chunk of Austria-Hungary, they better come in on the side of the Allies, who will obviously divide, or should probably divide up Austria at the end of the war. In 1916, they invade Austria. Their initial success turns out to be a disaster. The Austrians, with the German allies, counterattack, retake all the land, and push way into Romania. So Romania is knocked out in 1916. 1917. We can say that Russia is knocked out. However, let's look at Italy just briefly. The Battle of Caporetto. Remember, the Italians have been attacking at Isonzo, like 11 major assaults, 11 major battles. The Austrians counterattack in late 1917. They capture, 100,000, 200,000 Italians. The Italian army breaks. We have reports when some of these Italians are captured, they yell to the Austrians, on the Rhone, kind of take our country. Had the Austrians pressed, they probably could have taken Venice. Now, Austria gets propped up. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Italy gets propped up because we have, 5 French divisions, 6 British divisions come in and help out. So they prop them up. Late in the war, Italy is capable of fighting again, but at least for about a year, or almost a year. Italy has been knocked back to the point where it's not really in control of its own destiny. In other words, it's not fighting well. So Italy is back on its heels. I guess not entirely out. But Russia is out in 1917. So everything has actually gone the way of Germany, except for the Western Front, where the French and British are, and the Americans are coming. If Germany now can pool its resources, deploy them onto the Western Front, and win, then they can win the war. When Russia's knocked out, the large number of German forces that have been deployed on the Russian front are now switched over to the Western Front. Now, of course, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, German troops are still kept in Russia to control the area, nothing else. Of course, later to bring in grain. These are not the best troops. The best troops are sent to the Western Front. For the first time since 1914, really, Germany has a plurality of manpower on the Western Front. There are more German troops than French and British combined. Now, this is not a huge difference. Say, well, if you have a superior in numbers, you clearly have an advantage. There's no doubt about that at all. On the other hand, remember when you're fighting in trench warfare and you have the same number of men attacking the same number of defenders, this is not enough. You're going to have a heavy majority, at least 3 or 4 times. And quite frankly, it wouldn't be a bad idea if you had 9 or 10 times as many men in the attack. This does not take away the ability of the British and the French to defend themselves. But now the Germans rightly believe this is their opportunity. Can they win the war? Now, I've made a big deal about politics in Germany. Oh, what do we got here? I made a big deal about politics in Germany. What had happened by the end of 1916. Any guise of civilian government over the nation has really disappeared. There's no formal statement that Hindenburg and Ludendorff are actually running the state, and in fact they are. They have no official position other than military, but they're calling the shots. Remember, at the very beginning of this course, I argued that, going back to von Clausewitz, that war is diplomacy by another means. I still believe that to be true. But diplomacy now is not a civilian diplomacy. The diplomacy now is a military diplomacy. It's not unfair to call Hindenburg and Ludendorff a military dictatorship. Hindenburg is kind of the showy guy, the Prussian aristocrat. He's kind of like a figurehead. The man who's actually calling the shots is Ludendorff. We've met him before. Let's meet him again. Remember, I don't like him for a lot of reasons, one of which is generalship, another of which is supporting the Nazis in the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. Man, it's easy to dislike. Now, so what do you try to do? There are 2 armies facing Britain, there are 2 armies facing Germany on the Western Front. It's no secret that the French army is the weaker of the 2 armies. The British, of course, remember they've got Canadians, Anzacs there as well, are a very formidable force. The 2 best armies left standing in 1918 are the British Army and the German Army. So you would think, logically, would it not make sense? That if Ludendorff wants to attack, it would attack the weaker of the 2 members. And obviously attack France. Let's go back to the Western Front. The French are occupying the west, the largest stretch, the largest number of miles by far, are being occupied down here by the French. A few Belgians right here, not consequential in any real sense. But the British Army, therefore, is along here, up here. Now, let's say Ludendorff had decided to attack the French. Could they break the front? Well, since they broke, which I'll mention in a few minutes, they broke the British front, well, they probably could have broke the French front. I don't doubt that really at all. But then what? Okay. You bust through down here, let's say right here, and now you got in here, now what do you do? Well, I would argue that maybe you can roll up the front, attack in both directions to roll up the line. But of course, the French are going to counterattack. I mean, you can kill a lot of Frenchmen unless the French army collapses. Are you going to be able to drive all the way to Paris? Probably not. But now let's look up on the British sector. While Britain is the stronger of the 2, what could happen if you could get down here? What would happen if you could bust through the British lines? One of the immediate objectives is a city right here of Amiens. It's kind of hard to see on this map. It's right here. The city of Amiens is a major supply area for the British. Yeah, the British they have other supply areas, Calais and Rouen, for example. But the British have brought a lot of supplies right here. If you can take Amiens, then Britain should be unable to support themselves which means that they'll have a lot less materiel, which quite frankly means that there's a really good chance that the British will collapse. And if you can continue this breakthrough and go over here and reach the channel, and that's perhaps way too optimistic, but there's an objective which is a lot closer, according to Ludendorff, in going through the British than is going through the French and try to take Paris. So bust through over here. Can we say attacking the stronger of the two is perhaps not the best strategy? Well, Ludendorff thinks it is. What he's trying to do, let's get back up here. Maybe I'm a little bit. Okay, attacks the British. Don't get too far ahead of myself. Once again, I probably have this out of logical sequence. I should probably talk about the infiltration tactics, the stormtroopers that Ludendorff and other military leaders in Germany figure out. Remember, we've been fighting for almost 4 years on the Western Front. The Germans tried to bust through on several major offensives, all of which had failed. The French and British tried to break through the German positions, also in a series of battles, also all of which end up in failures. Remember, going back to our earlier argument, I said that, well, what you need is new ideas, rather than simply refine old ones. We say the Germans come up with new ideas. They do refine those old ones as well. This is not throwing out everything you've learned, but now let's go in and emphasize certain things. Sometimes we call this infiltration tactics. Remember the stormtrooper tactics. Ludendorff takes his best men, take them out of the line, and you practice these things. You actually get an area behind the lines that is somewhat configured like the positions you're going to be taking. So when you go out and you attack your enemy position, there's no surprises here. You know exactly what it looks like, and you know exactly what to do under these circumstances. You're not going to have a week-long bombardment. Remember the Battle of the Somme. These horrific bombardments that were done certainly tell people what's going on. See, what Ludendorff wants to do is have a ferocious and very quick bombardment. 5 hours. Of course, they're trying to have proper coordination. Remember the creeping barrage, the men advance. It's like a timetable. You pull out your watch. So if your watches are correct, pull out your watch. Then you go a certain number of 100 yards. I should say 100 meters because we are talking about the metric system. A number of 100 meters in a series of minutes. And the artillery knows to keep going. Now, one thing that's very unfortunate as far as the artillery is concerned, they really don't know how successful the men are. And there's always a possibility in a creeping barrage that you'll either outrun your people or you'll hold them up because they can get faster than actually the barrage would allow them. Better coordination, yes. Now, stormtroop tactics, infiltration tactics. Rather than rushing in, these large attacks, large number of men, pounding into one position, look at the weakest places in the lines. The areas, the redoubts, the areas that are most heavily defended. You don't have to take them by assault. Bypass them. Get on the side, push in. Don't worry about your flanks. The men, the British in the trenches, in these more heavily defended areas, are not going to counterattack you, and they're quite correct. So you punch through. And of course, you practice all this and your use of hand grenades. They're actually even toying with the idea of having men having assault rifles, in other words, fully automatic weapons coming up. This is very, very important in the Second World War. There is a work toward this. The famous BAR, Browning Automatic Rifle, which is very helpful because it's a fully automatic rifle. It's got 15 rounds, but it can be used by infantrymen. That's developed in 1918 by the Americans. Extremely important, however, in the Second World War and the Korean War. So the development of these things are not necessarily helping what's going on in 1918 from the German standpoint, but the ideas are there. I brought in my examples of World War I rifles before. The idea that, well, these things are kind of big, they're kind of cumbersome, and if you're running forward as an infantryman, you have a shorter version of that, so you can fire it a little bit more effectively. So they're toying with weapons. On the 21st of March, 1918, the Germans, Ludendorff, launches his all-out assault. 5-hour bombardment, and they hit the British. And these tactics have a lot of initial success. Now, you'll read books. I'm sure you've read a lot of books on World War I. I hope you continue to read them. I continue to read them. It's remarkable how many times they keep on saying the most costly day in the history of Britain, in the history of the British Army, was July 1st, 1916. However, there's a book by Martin Middlebrook, a British historian. He wrote that magnificent book I think I already mentioned to you, called The First Day on the Somme. In kind of a follow-up effort, he wrote another book, not quite as gut-wrenching, but a good book nonetheless, about the first day, March 21st, 1918, in which he argues, remember there's 60,000 casualties on the first day of Somme. He argues in the first day of the Ludendorff offensive that the British suffer 85,000 casualties. Now, let's couch that a little bit. The 60,000 men on the Somme are killed and wounded, largely. When the Germans attacked the British positions on March 21st, 1918, they capture about 20,000. So those are casualties. When we say killed and wounded, the number has to be lower. Even at that, Martin Middlebrook argues that the battle obviously prisoners are battle casualties. The men actually killed and wounded. It's like 65,000. If that's correct, and I do admit that the other historians haven't really picked up on this, if that's correct, then the first day of the battle of the Ludendorff offensive is the most costly day in the history of Britain. Well, break the front. Yeah, they do. Remember the Germans there was this bulge right here, Battle of the Somme. The Germans had withdrawn to straighten out the line, but now they just pound right through here. Some books say that they get 40 miles in 2 weeks. I've read other books that say that's like 1 week or 10 days or even 5 days in a brief period of time. Remember, it took months for the British to grab a few miles. Whichever numbers you want to look at, whichever dates you want to use, the Germans take that back and considerably more in a very, very brief period of time. So they pound in deep. They actually break the front. They get beyond all the trench systems. And there's been years to build these up. They get beyond the trench system. They're literally out in fields like we haven't seen since 1914, where you get in ruts of old roads and use them for defenses. Now, unfortunately for the British, they start running into colonial troops. Excuse me, the Germans. They start running into colonial troops who are pretty mean dudes that have a tendency to blunt this back here. Now, before I tell you exactly what happens, let me back off and say, remember the Prime Minister of Great Britain is David Lloyd George. Interesting man for a number of reasons. One of which is, of all the prime ministers of Britain, he's the only one who did not speak English as his native language. His native language is Welsh. Of course, his English was perfect. He hates Douglas Haig. He hates, can I say that again? He doesn't like Douglas Haig. He thinks he's a butcher and just getting people killed. He wants to remove him, but remember, Haig has too many political allies. Even the Prime Minister of Great Britain doesn't think he can relieve him, but he wants to keep his men from being killed. So he withholds troops. Some books say that, well, Haig was saying, well, let's have all these guys that might be a little sick. We'll get a few 100,000 guys in Britain. Other books say that he's saying that he has to have troops in Britain to defend against Germany. Really? I mean, Germany does not control the seas, not even close. And they're going to take an invasion force from Belgium or Germany and attack Britain? No, he's not doing this for defense. He's keeping manpower out of the hands of Haig. So Haig will not have enough manpower to go on these senseless offensives and get these people killed. However, there are large numbers of well-trained reserves sitting in Britain. When the Germans attack, now all these men, hundreds of thousands of men, are on ships and they come across here to reinforce the British front. The Germans are actually victims somewhat of their own success. Once again, I talked about the problems of the creeping barrage. Another issue is that you do outrun your artillery. There's a lot of horses going to move these guns up. And while the initial assault was well orchestrated, well planned, when you get in the broken area where this place has been obliterated by shell fire for years, you get in there, it becomes more difficult to deploy your guns. It also becomes more difficult to keep unit cohesion because initially the Germans were trained, they know what to do right off the bat. But once you get in 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles, then they have to react to situations for which they have not been trained. Another factor is this. German propaganda has been saying our submarine war is starving the British. They're hurting really bad. That's a lie. It's not really true. It's not as pleasant in Britain as you like it to be. Food is rationed, for example. But in reality, when the Germans go into the British trenches and they capture men, the Germans are wearing these old worn out threadbare uniforms. And the British are wearing pretty nice clothing. And the Germans have an adequate diet. I'm not going to say it's fun in any real sense. They usually get enough calories, even though they might not like it very much. In All Quiet on the Western Front, Remarque makes a big deal about the Germans being hungry all the time. Largely true late in 1918, but it's not really true until then. However, the Germans bust into let me get it right, said it backwards. The Germans bust into the British trenches and they see food and like a lot of nicer food than the Germans used to eating. Can this hurt your morale? It can, but it also can slow you down. The guys are coming in, they're seeing meat and a lot of things that they don't see very much of in the German army. We slow you down because you're going to plunder a little bit. You're going to grab a few things, stick in your pocket so you can eat it later. Part of the issue is it runs out of steam. After a few weeks, your men are tired, you have logistical problems, your artillery. They do not take Amiens. It's very important to remember that. They do not take Amiens. Well, something that the Allies hadn't had, which they probably should have had very early in the war, is a unified command. What we've seen happening is the French do what they want to do, the British do what they want to do, and, well, let's talk to each other. Let's get together in a council. We'll discuss various things, maybe, and to keep cooperation up. Now, that seems to work, but isn't it better? Isn't it better to have a unified command? You have one leader that is over both armies. So this is not a matter of negotiation. The one leader is in a position to tell everybody what to do. This is Ferdinand Foch. He's elevated over Pétain. We met him early in the war. Remember, he's over the school in France that starts arguing very strongly about the events. Elan, enthusiasm. Go out there and hit. He was wrong in that case. However, now he's elevated. He's the commander of all the forces. So he doesn't have to ask permission to the British. He doesn't have to negotiate with them. He can actually tell the British what to do. They don't have to like it, but they should follow it. Before I get off this map entirely, let me give you an idea of what's going on here. I get that any bigger? Oh, I do this all the time. I'm never successful. Oh, by the way, notice these photograph right here, these New Zealand troops. Notice they are not in trenches. They're out in a grain field. You can see when you get out of the trenches, then you actually do have people fighting once again in fields, which you really haven't seen since 1914. Okay. To Ludendorff's great chagrin, they're not successful. This grinds down. The British fall back. You see, the farther the Germans advance, the farther they were from their supplies and support. The farther the British pull back or push back, the closer they are to their areas of support. It's a little bit like a spring. When you press more on the spring has more tension, therefore it's greater ability to resist. The German accomplishment is very impressive. It's quite stunning, actually. But it does not break through. It does not win the war. They do not take Amiens. Well, let's take a look at some of the other offensives here. When this doesn't work, I mean, wouldn't you think, at least I would think, that with the additional troops that Germany has back here, well, if this doesn't work, why don't we just go in and keep on pounding? But Ludendorff decides, well, let's hit him another place. Up here by Ypres, remember? We talked about the Ypres salient, first Battle of Ypres, second Battle of Ypres, the third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele. Remember the bogged down in mud, it's a terrible thing, can't hardly move at all. The Germans break the front up here too. What I don't know is how serious mud was a problem. It's going to be a problem. What had the ground dried out since 1917? It probably had. Nonetheless, this is a big success. You push the British right out of the trenches. But now what? You really have not taken Ypres. They don't take Ypres. And you haven't busted out to Calais. 5 major German offensives. Eventually they hit the French. I get a little bit better map of all these advances. These are the big offensives up here. They do bust through against the French down here as well. Nonetheless, what do you get out of this? One of the reasons why they decided the French down here, since the British attack hadn't worked, and often when you have two armies in this case, the French and the British, you do have a tendency where the seam is where it's weakest. They're failures. 1918, of all the years of the war, has a larger number of casualties than any other year. And we don't even fight for just a little bit more, why we fight a little bit more than 10 months. Much gained, failures. Simple failures. Now what? One of the reasons why Ludendorff wanted to hit when he hit was to get there before the Americans show up. And when the Americans show up, things are going to change, and the Germans know they're coming. One of the things that a lot of times historians don't pay enough attention to was that when the flu hit the trenches, the Great Flu Pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, this is one of the most devastating ailments in human history. You might have to go back to some of the smallpox epidemics, or maybe even back to the Black Death, to get something that would be on this comparable scale, or shall we say even, well, the Black Death's worse, no doubt about that at all. But this is literally horrific. I can make an argument that the Spanish flu, or the Great Flu Pandemic, is one of the reasons why we have it is because of the First World War. Now, there is more than one theory. For many years, you'd read about this. And there was a bunch of U.S. soldiers, I believe it was in Kansas, and they were ordered to remove a dung heap. And so the guys got out and shoveled the dung heap. Within a matter of days, these guys are getting sick by the scores, just huge numbers of men getting sick. Now, during wartime, and you get guys sick, but you got to deploy them. You put them in units for practice. You put them on troop ships. Could you imagine what that would be like? All these guys jammed up. Then you take them over to Europe. You get out in Europe and you have your training, you have parades, and you deploy on the up the front, and guys are very close together. So rather than spreading out like probably should have been done, and wearing masks, which was not done by the troops very much, but was done at home, this might have been slowed down. Now, there are theories that it didn't really start in Kansas in March, because apparently the flu has been identified on corpses in other areas. Even the Eskimos, frozen ground, have gone up there and examined them and say, well, maybe somebody up here had the flu. And there might have been other places in the United States. On the other hand, and that might be true, but we do not read about the flu starting in Alaska and spreading out all over the world. These other theories, I believe there was a corpse found in Minnesota someplace. We don't read about that spreading either. What we do read about, and it might have been somebody came down from Alaska or Minnesota and talked to the guys, but it is in an army camp where we really get our first indication that it's here. It is horrific by any standards. This is counterintuitive. This doesn't make a lot of sense, but this is what the historians and doctors are saying about the flu pandemic. Usually, and every year we see influenza, every year. Weather gets cold, and it gets into rest homes, these old people, and it sweeps through them, so a lot of times they'll kill a lot of them. That's not surprising. We're almost used to that. It happens all the time. What is stunningly different about the Great Flu Pandemic is it tends to kill younger people, and it's more lethal to them than it is to the elderly. Let me try to explain it if I can. See, young people, young, vigorous guys in the military, you're great shape, and you get the influenza goes into your lungs. And because people are younger and stronger, your bodies fight it more. So it sends more fluid into your lungs to fight the disease, and that kills you. The death in the army is huge. Now, let's say, why do we call this the Spanish flu? Everybody is under censorship. Britain's under censorship. France is under censorship. Germany's under censorship. One thing you're not going to say in Germany, France, or Britain forever, so everybody's dying out here. You're not going to say that. But Spain is not involved in the war. Spain is not under that kind of restraint. So when it hits Spain, Spain talks about it. It's in the newspapers. It's publicized. So there's the belief, for a while anyway, well, it started in Spain. It didn't. But that's why it's called the Spanish flu. Horrible things happen. In October 1918, the war is still on. There's a big parade in Philadelphia. Big parade. Why do you have a parade in October? Sell bonds. We got to sell bonds to get enough money to support our military and support our men. So go out and buy bonds. It's a good idea. On the other hand, you have these big parades. Of course, thousands of people are jammed up together. And thousands of people die in Philadelphia over the next few weeks. There was one time when a man called a parade, and thousands of people died because of this, and he killed himself. He had obviously caused the death of all those people. My uncle Grant was young at this time frame. My dad was like 2, 3 years old, so Dad doesn't remember anything. Dad didn't get it. Uncle Grant didn't get it. But Uncle Grant talks about, well, what was it like? Well, we wore masks to cover our faces. He says, yeah, I went on horseback with my older brothers, and we did a few things like that. He didn't act like it was terribly debilitating. My Uncle Harold, who's older than Uncle Grant, he lost 2 friends in his grade school class. Good friends. My dad's from Mount Pleasant. Of course, my uncles are from Mount Pleasant too. Years ago, I went down. You know how it is in graveyards. We tend to bury people at times when they die. So I was looking through the cemetery at Mount Pleasant, and I saw young men, children really, who had died in the fall of 1918. I wonder if that's my Uncle Harold's friends. My Uncle Arl, born in 1898, was in the Army during the First World War. He was not deployed to France. He's going to Utah State University up in Logan. He is ROTC. He got the flu. The story he was telling was this. He's in the beds. They're laying there. They've got, I don't know where it was, one of the buildings up there. Hundreds of scores of men are sick, all laying down there groaning and that kind of thing. And they came down the line and they said, well, here's another one. And they took his blanket off as though perhaps they were removing him as a corpse. My uncle kind of roused and pulled the blankets back. The one thing I really feel bad about is Uncle Arl died when he was 84. I knew him quite well, actually. I used to go see him frequently. I asked him all kinds of questions about growing up in the floods and seeing bear up in the Manti La Sal, seeing bears in the Manti La Sal canyons. It's all interesting. I never asked him about the flu. I wish he could have told me something more. It depends on which study you want to read. But early on, they were saying like 20 million people died worldwide of the flu. Now that's more people, if 11 million is correct, the number of men who were killed in the First World War. That's double that. However, more recent studies have jacked this up to 50, 60 million. The last thing I read on this, the book was saying 100 million perhaps people died. Could that have been prevented had there not been a war? I'm not sure, but the war actually clearly spread it out dramatically. When this goes into the trenches, remember the Germans have really failed in their attempts. Go back to this one. Have failed in their attempts. In reality, they're starting to die like flies. Can they possibly renew the offensives when we have another major killer that's even more lethal than the war itself? In fact, we look at U.S. troops. We often say that more U.S. troops died because of the flu than died in combat. That's largely true because the U.S. Army was not heavily deployed. The entire force, the 4 million men which we put in uniform, had not been deployed at the front. A smaller percentage of that. So these guys that are not at the front, they get the flu and they die. The Germans have shot their wad. They don't have anybody left. They've taken their best units out. They've got them shot up. Now what can they do? Well, they can hold on, perhaps. As badly as the French and the British are hurt by this, the Allies now go on the offensive. Let's attack again. If you look at the Western Front, when the Germans were back here, that's more defensible. Now they punched out here, and you can see these major bulges. In these major bulges, you can see how much more area they are potentially exposed to for attack. So the Allies go on the offensive. Yes, they're suffering from the flu as well, but they go on the offensive. Because the Battle of Amiens, 8th to the 15th of August, the Germans are pushed back. What the British have now are larger numbers of tanks. They still have their cavalry, but the cavalry, can we say, is still not terribly efficient, but they try to deploy it. Got large numbers of tanks, hundreds of tanks. And it's like, yeah, there's aerial reconnaissance, a little bit of ground attack coming from the aircraft. But using, can we say, a variety of means of attack. This seems to be working. It's like, well, we figured this out now, haven't we? We've now finally figured out how to beat the Germans. You can make that argument, but there's another way of looking at this. The Germans are not as aggressive as they were before, and they are falling back anyway. So attacking a position where people are falling back and say, well, I took the ground, is not the same thing as saying that they were resisting and trying to hold. However, looking at this issue, we do see that this is the kinds of things that's going to be re-examined in the Second World War. Aerial attack, tanks, ground attack. To come in and knock your enemies over. This is done by virtually every belligerent in the Second World War. Now, Ludendorff realizes he can't win. He shot his wad. If you can't win, what are you fighting for? I guess there's a difference of not, I should say that when this comes down, I believe it's on August 9th, Ludendorff has a nervous breakdown. He virtually collapses mentally. He doesn't know what else to do. Well, quite frankly, there is nothing else to do. The Germans are withdrawing. I'm not saying they're running, but there are times, can I give you an idea of the pullback? This takes months, largely starts in August. Let's ignore this because this is occupation forces at the end of the First World War. See, now they're pulling back. The Americans are hitting in here, the French are hitting here, the British are hitting up here. Now, it takes months, really until November, when the Germans are pulling back. One of the reasons why they're doing this is the army is becoming less reliable. There are times when combat units, the only people who are still manning the guns are the officers, because the infantry won't follow their orders anymore. Sometimes they're just simply withdrawing without orders. As the line straightens out here, you can see it's more defensible because there's less mileage of frontage. The Germans are arguing that, well, maybe we can just continue this withdrawal and we can hold out. Yeah, maybe, but to what end? You can't win the war. Can you keep from losing the war? That's the other issue. Do the Germans really have the ability to hold indefinitely? Well, the Germany and its alliance is falling apart. Bulgaria, one of their allies, sues for peace. A separate peace. Austria-Hungary is falling apart. The Czechs, which later are going to make Czechoslovakia, are declaring their independence before the Austrians have actually signed a peace, I shouldn't call it a peace treaty, an armistice to stop fighting. There is civil disorder all over Germany. The German Navy, I haven't talked much about them for quite a while. The surface fleet, it's not really the battle fleet it was in 1916, because when the commanders realized that we're not going to go out and fight the British again, they start pulling manpower off, retraining them to use them in infantry, start using their resources also for the infantry. But then the admirals say, well, this is our chance to go out with a blaze of glory. We will take our combat fleet out and we will go out and attack the British and we will die like men. And the sailors revolt. They're not going to die for nothing. Combat troops are becoming unreliable. The home front is breaking down as well. There are Marxist groups. There are people that are socialists in the fact that they don't like the government, they don't like the aristocracy. And as the war goes bad, their numbers increase because they look at Marxism as an alternative to the failed system that they've been functioning under. And so there's rebellions, there's civil disorder. In some areas, these, call them rebels if we want to, there are revolutions coming in Germany in a little while. They start grabbing areas of transportation. They're coming in grabbing train depots. They're seizing food supplies. And how are you going to deal with all of that? We can send combat troops back. And this is going to happen later on in 1919. But right now, what do you do to keep the war going? It's breaking down. The Germans simply don't have the resources to keep this up. Finally, even though the Kaiser had gone to the front and declared victory early in the offensives, finally they come to him and say, Your Royal Majesty, we cannot secure your safety. And he flees. He has to leave Germany. The head of the titular, by this time, head of state, has got to flee Germany. And he goes over here to the Netherlands, which I will tell you why he fled over there in a little while. The Netherlands don't like the British for a number of reasons, one of which is stealing their merchant marine, the other one which is putting a blockade on them, even though they're a neutral power. Germany, this idea of holding this doesn't work. If Germany stays in the war, which is a dumb thing to do, of course the Allies who are still in the offensive. At one time, Douglas Haig says, the orders of the day is everybody to attack all day, any position. Hit them as much as you can, which is effective. So we're pulling back here. Eventually, these French, British, and American armies are going to pound into Germany. And to what point? You really can't win. You want to have Germans being killed on German soil. Bad idea. Now, let me just bounce back a little bit. I think one of the reasons why the Germans are rebellious and they don't want to continue the war is the impact of the blockade. The Germans have been tightening their belts for a long time. They're seeing some very severe problems. I think that eventually hurts morale and eventually keeps people from having the will to continue. Now let's jump up to the 1990s. We have this war going on, the Serbians against the Bosnians in the Balkans and the Croatians. And the idea is, bantered among a number of various countries, what are we going to do? Well, everybody sits back and watches the battles continue. I used to watch this on the news. People running through a gauntlet of fire to get some water, and people being shot down, literally in the streets. Women 62 years old, boyfriend and girlfriend being shot down. And the Americans and the world's watching this. Well, what do we do? We don't know what to do. The argument was, well, let's put a blockade on everybody, just cut everybody off. And then people came back and said, well, a blockade has never won a war. Let's look at World War I. I'm not going to say it's simple. I'm going to say it's complicated. I'm going to say there's a number of factors. But I do believe very strongly one of the major reasons why Germany collapses in 1918 was the blockade. So to say a blockade has never been effective in winning a war, I think you have to be very careful with that argument. Well, the Germans say, we send a delegation, we've got to meet, got to talk to the French. And what they want is a ceasefire. And armistice, in other words, you simply stop all the fighting. I believe it's on the 7th. They met with the French delegation led by Foch up here. Foch is a hard nut. He even had a son that was killed in the war. And he hates the Germans, so he's not going to be conducive to being nice to them in any sense whatsoever. Well, they come forward and the Germans say, we want to have an armistice. Bingo, right now, in force. And Foch refuses. He says, we have to have conditions. Now, had the war been stopped right there, thousands of men's lives would have been saved. It could have been stopped. Okay. We're not going to allow it to be stopped right now. And the Germans say, what are your conditions? And the conditions they're handed. Okay. You've got to evacuate everything. You've got to hand your navy over to Britain, your entire navy, your combat navy. You've got to withdraw from all these areas. I just mentioned that. You've got to pay for damages. You've got to hand over thousands of artillery pieces. You've got to hand over the Air Force. You've got tens of thousands of machine guns. And then you're going to have to hand over all the rolling stock. And rolling stock is essentially trains, cabooses, and all the transportation you have to France. You're going to have to withdraw initially for a few miles, but by the end of the year, you're going to have to withdraw from all this. These are pretty harsh conditions. What Foch wants to make sure, for the Germans to meet these conditions, they couldn't possibly go back to war again. These guys about gag. And they say, well, we don't have permission to do this. So they send the information back to Berlin, which is under siege, people in the streets, the army's unreliable. Berlin comes back and says, sign anything. So a few minutes after 5 a.m., on the 11th of November, 1918, the Germans signed the armistice, agreeing to all the conditions. Now, the one thing they had to decide on, when are you going to end this? You can't just end it right now. A good idea would perhaps be noon. They choose 11 a.m. Let me tell you one of the reasons why they choose 11 a.m. There's 1 hour of difference in time in Germany. In other words, Germany is 1 hour ahead. That's not true anymore. Europe, Britain, and Britain's different. France and Germany are on the same time zone. They're different time zones this time frame. So you say noon in Germany is 11 a.m. over here. The entire front is connected by radio. Now I realize you're moving out, but you connect by radio, and of course radio travels literally the speed of light. So you get the information, bang, 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 as fast as you can. So within virtually minutes. Now some troops are a little bit less well connected. There might be a few guys on patrol, something like that. What's that? 6 hours? It used to really bother me. I kept on running across things I found disturbing. For example, I read in a book that 5 minutes before 11 a.m., a U.S. regiment was ordered to attack a German position. What on earth for? That was the tip of the iceberg. Half of the U.S. divisions were ordered to attack. U.S. division ordered to attack. The war is over. No, it's over. Within a matter of hours, after 11 a.m., the Germans are going to have to pull back a couple of miles. Anything you could possibly take right now has no purpose whatsoever. When they're attacking, the Germans get up in their trenches and go like this. Go back, go back. I mean, you got to shoot them because they'll kill you if you don't kill them. The Germans don't want to do this. It's over, ladies and gentlemen. It's over. There's a real problem here. How do you understand why these men would do this? Why the men would continue to order these up? Even though Pershing orders these men to attack, some of the generals say, I'm not moving. They can court-martial me if he wants to, but we're not moving. The other ones didn't move. Some of them moved on their own volition. They attacked. Now, it's very hard to sit a man down and say, why did you murder your men? Can we speculate as to why they did this? Pershing says that the Germans don't know they're beat. Ladies and gentlemen, the Germans knew they were beat. Okay, there's no doubt about this at all. Germany loses the war. But according to Pershing, they won't realize they've lost unless we actually invade their soil. There might be something to that. On the other hand, nothing's going to happen after 11 a.m., no matter how possibly successful you can be in the last few hours of the war. You're not going to bust through and go into Germany. Another piece of speculation. Well, these men spend their entire lives. We're talking to the professional officers, the higher up, the field grades, the colonels and generals. They've been wanting to do this their entire lives. They've practiced West Point for a long time. This is their last chance. There's not going to be another war. These guys are in the 50s and 60s. They're going to be retired and dead before there's any possibility they're going to be deployed again. It's your last chance to do it. Your last chance to lead men in a furious battle. Down in Scipio, Utah, there's a monument to a man by the name of Edward Carl Peterson. You know where Scipio is? You buy gas on the way to Las Vegas, off I-15, small town. And years ago, a student came to see me, and she says, oh, by the way, my great-great-great-uncle was killed on the last day of the war. I was offering my sympathy. They didn't really realize about this until her grandmother died, which would have been great-great-grandmother, would have been Edward Carl Peterson's sister. And then all these letters are there. She's mourning, oh, my brother, he died on the last day of the war. Now, I don't know how he died, but did he die in one of these insane attacks for no reason? You can imagine. Now, remember how many men died. More men died conservatively, we think, in these senseless attacks in the last hours of the war than died in the entirety of D-Day. Like 9,000 casualties at D-Day. There's over 10,000 conservatively that are casualties in these last few hours. So this is not a small number of people. There is a congressional investigation at the end of the war. People are complaining, my son died on the last day of the war, what's happening here? So there's a congressional investigation. And they even called Pershing in to testify. I was able to dig out some of the testimony here. Can we say Pershing is being evasive? The other people are as well. There is actually no conclusion to the investigation. Because, my goodness, for the good of our country, do we not have to make heroes out of our military leaders? That they're doing the right thing for us. And to bring all this up, that makes them look bad, is a bad idea for our government. So for political reasons, the congressional investigation is disbanded and nothing is really decided. Matthias Erzberger, he's one of the delegates. Here's a little caveat that always bugs me. It is the military, it's Ludendorff, it's Hindenburg, that bring Germany into ruin. But when it comes down to actually surrendering, signing the armistice, the military leaders withdraw and they hand it over to the politicians. Now the politicians are going to have to take the egg on their face for having signed this. He signs the armistice. He knows he's running a risk. A few years later, he's murdered. The armistice, 11 a.m., November 11th, 1918. You'd like to remember that? 11, November, 11 day, 11th hour, 1918. Some of the largest celebrations, literally in human history, take place in numerous places, all over the United States, all over New York City. Paris, London, go nuts. We also see this in the trenches. Sometimes when the war is over, some guys say they just lay down and just kind of astounded that they survived. The British Army, of course, Haig says, do not fraternize with the Germans. It's ignored. Guys go out, and some guys don't want to talk to the enemy. Some guys go out and embrace the enemy. The animosity is not deep enough after all those years for many of these men to continue their hatred. We have survived. I've got a few minutes left on our lecture time today, and I'm going to do something perhaps as foolish as I did last time. A lot of times students will ask me certain things like, what are the best books on World War I? And I give them my opinions, but then finally I decided, well, why don't I just give you a list of books which I've read on World War I, or can remember having read. And remember, this goes back for a lengthy period of time. Let's take a look here. Come on, Albert. You can do it. You can do it. If I don't keep on doing things successfully, I'm going to start believing my own abilities. It's enlarged a little bit easier for you to see. Now, are these all the books I've read? I don't know. I have a friend, history professor, and we've talked about books. We talked about, wrong way, and we've talked about, he's recommended books to me. There's one book he recommended me. You really ought to read this book. Wow. So I wrote down the author title, ran out to the bookshelves, and I'd already read it. I didn't remember having read it. Looked at it and go, sounds familiar. I'd already read it. So is this complete? I don't know. Of course, the other issue is, what are the really good ones? You don't want to just have a list of books. You want to have a list. You want to have the best ones. Now, this is my own opinion. A student was interested in World War I, came to see me a number of years ago. And he says, I want to get some credit. I want to get some reading conference credit. I want to read a few thousand pages, get a few hours of credit. And I want to read the best World War I books. What do you recommend? So I gave him all these recommendations, books that really knocked my socks off. A few weeks later, he comes back and says, this is boring. I don't like these. Okay. It's a personal opinion. The books that you enjoy might not be the books that I enjoy. But let me give you an idea. Let me give you some recommendations. Luigi Albertini, an Italian, spent years finding out and interviewing people. They were still alive in the 20s and 30s as to what they thought and what happened. He looks at all these documents. I just kind of glanced through the first and second volumes, kind of put in the background. The third volume was stunning. Now, there is one real problem with this. You'd think that after all this research, going back many years, and all these interviews, that Albertini would come across with this grand thesis as to really who's responsible. He died before he wrote that. Now, I would argue, looking at the research that he's presented, you do get a pretty good idea in which direction he's going. To try to help you understand the origins of the First World War, this is essential reading. Let's go down my list a little bit. Now, the ones I recommend are these. And if we were in a classroom, I could give you a handout, then we could read down through these. I'm giving you recommendations, and people say, well, what's the best ones? Well, the ones with asterisks are the ones I consider to be the best. But they want the best of the best. Well, I really haven't done that. I apologize. I like compilations of primary sources. These are some of them. Tony Ashworth's Live and Let Live system, which I mentioned very shortly. This is a stunning example of how the guys on both sides of the trenches try to get along with each other. The Great Influenza. The only trouble with this is he goes in these long biographies of people that were working in science. Well, that's nice. But on the other hand, what I want to read is about the flu pandemic. It's good, but if you read it, can you say jump over the boring parts? This is often considered to be one of the best primary sources. It's a very, very good account. This guy's 35 years old. He makes barrels. and he keeps notes throughout the war. It's a Frenchman. Billy Bishop was one of the top aces. I believe he's Canadian. Had like 72 confirmed victories. What's it like to be in combat? It's very interesting. Aerial combat. Good book on the Christmas truce. We don't see as much as I would like to see on the Russian front. So when we have, and Prit Bhattar has written a number of, I've only read this one, unfortunately. I plan to read the others, but we do get a better idea of what's going on over here. General Pershing, The Americans, good book. Winston Churchill wrote a series of very large volumes. And I've sat down, starting out with the one in 1911, where he's talking about making decisions that is going to affect the naval war. He bogs me down in detail, so what I've actually done is read condensations of these. These are good books, but the one I most highly recommend is Part 3. Alan Clark, The Donkeys, remember, lions led by donkeys. He's talking about the failures of the high command. Christopher Clark wrote one of the interesting recent books, stating that it really wasn't the Germans' fault. The only criticism he's really got for this is that, well, did he actually measure what the German high command was thinking? Even at that, I think he's very persuasive. Now, he's not the only opinion that I find very valuable, but I think you'd find him interesting. Don Cogden, it is a compilation of sources on combat in the First World War. Bought it in high school. It's downstairs, it's yellowing. It's very nice. Trench Warfare, it's a modern classic. One of the best autobiographies. Remember, this guy's from Ogden, Utah, or he's living in Ogden, Utah at the time when he joined. And he was the one I told you about who got stitched, a machine gun on the Somme. And later on, he wrote a very important book. They made a movie over this. Unfortunately, I don't believe the movie exists. It was a silent film. Another book, remember, this is an American historian who said it's not the Germans' fault. So other historians start calling him names. He's a German lover. It's a very good book by Niall Ferguson, but some of his conclusions I thought were a little bit off the mark. He does say that the British did not go to war, did not need to go to war. And you can debate that if you want to. One of the things that kind of got me about him was that he was saying that one of the reasons why the war went on so long was that the men were having such a hard time. You see, remember, most of the accounts are written by upper class people who are not used to getting their hands dirty, not used to going without. While the men in the trenches, the lower class people, the working class people, are more used to putting up with privations, and they don't suffer that badly. See, I didn't give an asterisk. I have a little problems with some of his argumentation. This is a garbage book. I didn't care for this at all. I already told you that he's saying that women get interested in other women because men aren't around, and I don't believe that for 1 minute. War Against War publishes all these photographs of men with their faces blown off, and publishes all these photographs of men who are severely wounded in the war. I do have my copy. I don't look at it very often. It's extremely disturbing, but it's a very good book. Great War in Modern Memory. How does this influence the arts? How does this influence our mentality? And he's arguing, and I agree with the basic hypothesis, that this influences us in numerous ways, deep into society. He is the one that criticized Robert Graves for making things up. Having said that, oh, this is one of the great books. I don't even remember when I ran across that. I'm just looking for books on World War I. I can't remember where it was or when it was. Probably online. Started reading this thing, I'm going, whoa. stunningly good account. Martin Gilbert, very prolific historian, very good book. Robert Graves, a modern classic. Remember, its authenticity has been in question, so I didn't put an asterisk by it. On the other hand, it has been so well received for such a lengthy period of time. To understand World War I bibliography, I think you ought to read it. A lot of areas talking about some of these I really can't remember much of what they said. Some of these I have a hard time remembering having read them. You see how well my memory works. But I look down at some of these things, I'm going, wow, this is these are all friends. Some of these kind of get my pulse going up quite a bit. Hawkshield. Actually, he's written a couple of very, very good books. One is about the Belgians destroying the Congo, called King Leopold's Ghost, which is not really about World War I. But this is talking about society, pacifists, and women back in Britain. Very good book. Herbert Hoover's Memoirs, very good. Remember the Price of Glory. It still shocks me every time I think about it. Remember this about Verdun. Ernst Jünger, very, very good first-person account. One of the things about Jünger is kind of different than the other accounts is he was wounded, what did he say, 8 times? I guess I believe him. And he gives a very good account of the spring offensives in 1918. But he's kind of pro. We're in there and we got a lot of vigor and keep on going. I like John Keegan. In fact, I use this for a textbook. The reason why I like John Keegan, and I don't agree with everything John Keegan. There are other very good books on the First World War. But at least as far as reading assignments is for my students are concerned, I can give you a reading assignment which largely goes along with my lectures. Other books called Shotgun Effect, with everything's going on at the same time, it's very hard to give reading assignments. Herbert Hoover, talking about Belgian relief. The reason why I'm going through these things fairly slowly is I realize that if you want to review them, if you want to review them, then you can go back and look through this, even though you might not have a handout. And the trouble with Dwight E. Lee's book, it's a good book, I urge you to read it, but I don't think he's quite fair in his treatment. Rather than going through all the arguments that Germany was responsible, he simply says everybody agrees that Germany was responsible. I don't think it's that easy, but he does follow many of the other arguments quite well. I just finished reading that very good book a few months ago. Once again, eyewitness sources are to die for. Remember, I was telling you about Tolkien, and in reading this, it does go into a lot of detail in analyzing, both in The Hobbit and the Ring trilogy, what Tolkien was saying about the war. A very well-received first-person account, Devil in the Drum by Lucy. This one really blew me away. After having done this for a lengthy period of time, I keep on wondering, well, what else are you going to do to surprise me? And he surprises me. Now, the only trouble with this is there are fictional aspects because he tries to recreate conversations, and that's very hard to do. Other than that, I think the book's very authentic and very helpful. Now let's get down here. Lynn McDonald's written a series of very good books. Castles of Steel, about that thick, good book. Sean McMeekin has come by more recently and argued once again that the Russians set this up to get into war. Oh, I'm running out of time. Please excuse me. Let me go through this fairly rapidly then. Martin Middlebrook's First Day on the Somme, stunning. The Kaiser's Battle, a very good book. And this is the one where he argues that on the first day, March 21st, the casualty figures were more like 85,000 British dead. Gallipoli's very interesting. Alan Moorhead's book's old classic. Breaking the French Army. I read that fairly recently. It's a really good book. Another good first-person account. He likes war a lot, but he talks about it at some level. Now, remember I said there's this issue about the men dying the last hours of the war. And Joseph Persico's book is really the biggest discussion of that I've ever seen. Al Qaeda on the Western Front, remember, it's worth reading. You should read it anywhere. Every World War I historian should read it. But remember, it's a fiction. Richthofen wrote an autobiography before he was killed. I want you to, I know you can review this on YouTube, but I want you to have the opportunity of looking through these. Let me just mention one other, and I've got to turn you loose. When I was in junior high school, started reading about World War I, they made an awfully big deal. Let's go back up to it. About Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. What did everybody do? What did everybody say? The difficulty of the Guns of August doesn't really talk much about the assassination of Sarajevo. Kind of brushes past it. But what are the British doing? What are they saying? What's the conversations going on? Very well received at the time. My goodness, well received. They even said John Kennedy read this before he was assassinated in 1963. Really built it up. It's a pretty thick book. I read it. It's a good book, well worth reading. It really stops at the Battle of the Marne. She kind of leads up. What's happened at the Battle of the Marne? And she kind of ends the book. You could boil me in oil, and I could only tell you several facts that I could remember from this. One of which is when the commanders in Paris saw Kluge's First Army turn away from them, he's saying, he's showing me his flank. He's showing me his flank. Something easy to attack. It's been over 55 years ago since I read this. Maybe not over, close to 55 years ago. I'm going, well, I decided, well, you know, I want to listen to things, helps me relax. So I got this on DVD, not DVD, on CDs. So I'm going to listen to this again because I'm going to remember a few things and be a lot of fun. I didn't get past the first couple of discs. As she's presenting these things, bing, 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 lights are going off in my brain all the time. I remember that. I remember that. I don't because I can't call it up. But having read it even that long ago, there's still things hidden in my brain. I really wish I could tell you more about what I've read. And maybe if I was better in reviewing, buying these books and marking them up, it'd be a lot easier to go back and review. Now, I appreciate you. I've gone over. I apologize. I'm sorry about that. This is lecture 27. And I appreciate you being good students. And I appreciate your forgiveness and your patience. And I'll talk to you next time.